You know what gets me about the mountain men? It's not just that they survived in conditions that would kill most of us in a matter of hours. It's that for the longest time, nobody believed their stories were actually true. Think about this for a second. You're sitting in a tavern in St. Louis in 1825, and some grizzled guy with missing fingers starts telling you about a man who crawled 300 miles with his ribs hanging out after a bear tore him apart. You're going to buy that story? Of course not. You're going to figure he's been hitting the whiskey a little too hard and spinning another tall tale. But here's the thing that absolutely fascinates me. Those stories weren't tall tales at all. Long before any white man ever set foot in the Rocky Mountains, the Native American tribes who lived there already had a word for what was coming. They had stories. Sacred stories. And these weren't just campfire entertainment. These were spiritual narratives that tribes like the Crow and the Blackfoot and the Arapaho had been passing down for generations. The Crow people talked about pale men who could track a wounded grizzly bear through 3 solid days of blizzard. Now think about that. 3 days in a blizzard, following an animal that's bleeding and probably dying and definitely dangerous. The Blackfoot whispered, and I mean literally whispered, because these stories carried spiritual weight. Blackfoot about white warriors who survived arrow wounds that should have dropped them dead on the spot. Among the Arapaho, the medicine men told stories about mountain spirits who had somehow taken human form, men who walked in the high places where even the eagles didn't dare to fly. These weren't just stories about tough guys. These were spiritual accounts of beings who had transcended normal human limitations. Now here's where it gets really interesting. These stories existed before the mountain men showed up. The tribes were already expecting something extraordinary to emerge from the collision between European-American determination and the most extreme environments on the continent. And then, in the spring of 1823, Hugh Glass crawled out of the wilderness and proved every single one of those stories true. Glass had been mauled by a grizzly bear. And when I say mauled, I don't mean he got a few scratches and a good scare. This bear tore him apart. We're talking about exposed ribs, a broken leg, wounds so severe that his companions dug his grave and sat vigil waiting for him to die. They took his rifle, his knife, his gear, everything except the clothes on his back, because what was the point? Dead men don't need equipment. But Glass didn't die. He crawled 300 miles. Think about that distance for a moment. That's like crawling from New York City to Boston, with broken bones, with infected wounds, through territory controlled by hostile tribes who would have killed him on sight if they'd found him. He crawled at night to avoid detection. He ate berries when he could find them, maggots when he couldn't. He reset his own broken leg using a dead tree as leverage. When he reached the Cheyenne River, he built a raft out of fallen logs and floated downstream for days because he was too weak to walk. Glass emerged from that wilderness more dead than alive, but he emerged, and his survival sparked the first documented case of what would become a pattern. Mountain men were achieving feats that defied medical understanding. They were surviving in conditions that killed ordinary men. They were demonstrating abilities that bordered on the supernatural. Suddenly, all those Native American stories started making sense in a completely different way. You have to understand the environment these men were walking into. The high country of Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana wasn't just wilderness. It was wilderness designed to kill you. Winter temperatures that dropped to 50 degrees below zero. And I'm not talking about a cold snap that lasts a few days. I'm talking about months of cold, so intense that it literally freezes the moisture in your lungs. But then summer would come, and in those same mountain valleys, temperatures could hit 120 degrees. The altitude alone was enough to incapacitate men who weren't adapted to it. We're talking about peaks that rise over 14,000 feet above sea level, where the air is so thin that every breath is a struggle. Between those temperature extremes, you had everything else trying to kill you. Grizzly bears that could weigh 800 pounds and run faster than a horse. mountain lions that could drop on you from a tree branch without making a sound, rattlesnakes, flash floods, avalanches, and Native American war parties who quite reasonably viewed armed white men in their territory as threats to be eliminated. And in this environment, ACP-ACE, this absolutely lethal environment, mountain men didn't just survive, they thrived. They developed capabilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Now, here's what I find absolutely remarkable about all this. The convergence that created the mountain men was completely accidental. You had European American cultural values about individual achievement and self-reliance. You had economic pressure from the fur trade that made extreme risk-taking financially rewarding. You had the availability of firearms and steel tools that gave these men a technological edge. And you had the most extreme environment on the continent. Mix all those factors together, and you get human beings pushed to the absolute limits of what's possible. The Native American tribes recognized what was happening before the mountain men themselves did. They saw men who were transforming into something beyond ordinary human capability. The sacred stories they'd been telling for generations suddenly had living, breathing examples walking through their territories. But here's the crucial part that gets lost in all the adventure stories. This transformation didn't happen overnight. The mountain men weren't born with supernatural abilities. They developed them through a process of adaptation that was both physical and mental. Years of exposure to extreme conditions literally changed their bodies. Their lung capacity increased to deal with thin mountain air. Their muscle density increased to handle the constant physical demands. Their sensory awareness sharpened to levels that seemed almost psychic. And it wasn't just individual adaptation. The mountain men were creating a culture. They were developing survival techniques, sharing knowledge, and building social networks that enabled achievements no individual could accomplish alone. The annual rendezvous gatherings weren't just trade fairs, they were cultural laboratories, where survival innovations were tested, refined, and passed along. Mountain men would spend months in isolation, pushing the boundaries of human endurance, and then come together each summer to share what they'd learned. Think about the knowledge exchange happening at these gatherings. A man who'd figured out how to survive in 60 below temperatures would share his techniques with someone who'd developed better methods for reading weather patterns. Someone who'd learned new hunting strategies from a crow wife would teach them to men who'd never had contact with that tribe. Over the course of 15 or 20 years, this process created a body of survival knowledge that was unlike anything that had existed before in human history. These men were writing the handbook for human survival in the most extreme conditions imaginable. And the Native American tribes who witnessed this transformation understood something that later historians completely missed. They recognized that they were watching human evolution in real time. The mountain men weren't just tough guys who got lucky. They were examples of what human beings could become when the right pressures were applied under the right circumstances. The sacred stories that tribes had been telling for generations weren't prophecies, they were recognition. They were acknowledgement that the mountains themselves had the power to transform human beings into something extraordinary. When Hugh Glass crawled those 300 miles, he wasn't just surviving a bear attack. He was proving that the boundary between human and superhuman wasn't as fixed as people assumed. He was demonstrating that, under the right circumstances, with the right motivation, human beings could achieve things that seemed impossible. And Glass was just the beginning. Over the next 20 years, the mountains would produce a generation of men whose achievements would become the stuff of legend. Men whose survival stories would be dismissed as folklore until modern science finally developed the tools to prove they were true. The Native American tribes had been right all along. The mountains were creating something new, something that walked the line between the world of ordinary mortals and the domain of legend. And we're just getting started. Now here's where the story gets really wild. Because what happened in the 1820s wasn't just individual men accomplishing extraordinary things. What happened was the creation of a perfect storm: economic, cultural, and environmental forces that combined to forge ordinary human beings into something approaching legend. The fur trade explosion that kicked off in the early 1820s created pressure unlike anything we've seen before or since in American history. Think about the economics for a second. A successful mountain man could bring back beaver pelts worth more money than a factory worker back east would earn in 5 years. 5 years. We're talking about the kind of financial incentive that makes people do absolutely insane things. But here's the catch, and this is where it gets interesting. The price for that wealth was equally extreme. You had to survive in conditions that killed most men who tried. You had to develop skills that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. And you had to do it alone, hundreds of miles from any help, for months at a time. This created what I can only describe as the ultimate selection pressure. The mountains didn't care about your background, your education, or your social connections. The mountains cared about one thing. Could you adapt fast enough to stay alive? And out of this crucible emerged men like Jedediah Smith. Smith started as just another young guy looking to make his fortune in the fur trade. But when a grizzly bear ripped half his face off in the Black Hills, something remarkable happened. Instead of heading back to civilization like any reasonable person would do, Smith returned to the mountains. Not just returned, he came back stronger, more determined, and somehow more capable than before. By 1826, Smith had survived multiple grizzly bear attacks. Think about that for a moment. Multiple. Most people don't survive one encounter with an 800-pound predator. Smith survived several and kept going back for more. He'd been in firefights with Native American war parties that left half his companions dead. He'd led expeditions across desert terrain so brutal that it killed men who'd already proven themselves in the Rockies. But Smith's real achievement wasn't just survival, it was exploration. His expeditions opened up territories that government surveyors wouldn't reach for another 20 years. He was drawing mental maps of the American West, while simultaneously proving that human beings could adapt to conditions that seemed designed to kill them. Then you have Jim Bridger, and Bridger represents something completely different. Bridger started as a blacksmith's apprentice. No wilderness experience, no special training, nothing that would suggest he'd become one of the most capable navigators in American history. But the mountains transformed him into something extraordinary. Bridger's discovery of the Great Salt Lake in 1824 wasn't just geographical luck. It was the result of an intuitive understanding of Western topography that seemed almost supernatural. Bridger could look at a landscape and predict what lay beyond the horizon. He could read weather patterns days in advance with better accuracy than modern meteorologists. He could find water in terrain that looked completely barren to everyone else. And here's what gets me about Bridger. His mental maps were more accurate than official government surveys. We're talking about a guy who never had formal education, who learned navigation by trial and error in country where mistakes got you killed, and he was outperforming trained cartographers with the best equipment available. But Bridger's abilities went beyond just navigation. He could predict animal behavior with uncanny accuracy. He knew where beaver would build dams before the beaver did. He could track individual animals across hundreds of miles of rocky terrain, where most men couldn't follow a herd of buffalo. These weren't lucky guesses. This was environmental awareness developed to a level that most people would consider impossible. Now, the mountain men weren't developing these abilities in isolation. The annual rendezvous gatherings that started in the mid-1820s created something unique in American culture, a system for sharing and refining survival knowledge on a massive scale. Picture this. Every summer, men who'd spent months alone in the most extreme environments imaginable would gather at places like Horse Creek, Pierre's Hole, and Green River. These weren't just trade fairs. These were cultural laboratories where survival innovations were tested, demonstrated, and passed along. A mountain man who'd figured out a better way to set traps in frozen streams would teach. his technique to 50 other men. Someone who'd learned new tracking methods from a Shoshone wife would share that knowledge with trappers who'd never had contact with that tribe. Men who'd developed better ways to read weather signs would demonstrate their methods to anyone willing to learn. Over the course of a few years, this system created a body of survival knowledge that was unlike anything that had existed before in human history. The mountain men were crowdsourcing solutions to problems that most human beings never even encounter, and the results were extraordinary. By the late 1820s, mountain men were routinely accomplishing feats that should have been impossible. They were surviving injuries that would have killed men with access to modern medical care. They were traveling distances that modern athletes would consider superhuman. They were adapting to environmental conditions that pushed human physiology to its absolute limits. Take Kit Carson. Carson started as a farm boy in Kentucky, with no particular skills or advantages, but the mountains transformed him into perhaps the most capable tracker and scout in American history. Carson's ability to read landscapes went beyond simple observation. He could predict animal behavior days in advance. He could locate water sources that were invisible to other experienced outdoorsmen. He could navigate through territory he'd never seen before with better accuracy than men who'd lived there for years. But here's what's really remarkable about Carson. His tracking abilities operated on a level that seemed almost psychic. Carson could look at disturbed grass and tell you not just what animal had passed through, but when it had passed, where it was going, and what its physical condition was. He could follow tracks across solid rock, where there was literally nothing visible to track. These weren't party tricks. These were survival skills developed through years of exposure to conditions where a mistake meant death. Carson's life depended on reading environmental signs with perfect accuracy, and that pressure forged abilities that transcended normal human capability. And Carson wasn't unique. The rendezvous system was producing dozens of men with similar capabilities, men who could navigate by stars through territories where no white man had ever traveled, men who could predict weather changes with better accuracy than modern forecasting, men who could survive on resources that most people wouldn't even recognize as food. The cultural exchange happening at these gatherings was creating something completely new in human history. European technological knowledge was combining with Native American environmental wisdom and pure innovation born of necessity. The mountain men were developing survival techniques that drew from multiple traditions while pushing beyond what any single culture had achieved. Think about the knowledge transfer involved here. A mountain man who'd married into a Crow family would bring decades of accumulated tribal wisdom to the rendezvous. That knowledge would combine with innovations developed by men who'd spent years alone in the wilderness, plus technological improvements made by former blacksmiths and gunsmiths who understood how to modify equipment for extreme conditions. The result was a survival system that represented the absolute pinnacle of human adaptation to extreme environments, and it was happening in real time, with immediate feedback from the most demanding conditions imaginable. But here's what I find most fascinating about this whole process. The mountain men themselves probably didn't fully understand what they were becoming. They were focused on immediate survival, on making money, on getting through another winter without dying. They weren't thinking about human evolution or the limits of human capability. They were just trying to stay alive long enough to get rich, and in the process they accidentally discovered what human beings could become when the right pressures were applied under the right circumstances. They proved that the boundary between possible and impossible wasn't as fixed as people assumed. They demonstrated that human potential could stretch far beyond what civilized society considered normal. The Native American tribes who witnessed this transformation understood what was happening better than the mountain men themselves. They recognized that they were watching human evolution in real time. They saw men who were becoming something beyond ordinary human capability, and the tribes were right. By the end of the 1820s, the mountains had produced a generation of men whose abilities seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Men who could survive anything the wilderness could throw at them. men who had genuinely become the legends that earlier generations had only imagined. The forge was working, and it was about to produce achievements that would seem impossible until modern science finally developed the tools to prove they were true. By the mid-1820s, something unprecedented was happening in the American wilderness. The mountain men weren't just surviving anymore. They were mastering conditions that should have been impossible for human beings to endure. And I'm not talking about getting lucky once or twice. I'm talking about consistently, repeatedly accomplishing feats that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. This was the Golden Age, 1825 to 1840, 15 years, when mountain men achieved things that modern people still have trouble believing actually happened. Take Hugh Johnson. Now, Johnson's story is one of those accounts that got dismissed as frontier mythology for over a century, because when you hear what Johnson accomplished, your first reaction is going to be, "That's impossible. No human being can survive that." Johnson was trapping beaver in the Wind River Mountains during the winter of 1829, when a blizzard hit that was so severe it killed wildlife that had lived in those mountains for thousands of years. The temperature dropped to something approaching 70 degrees below zero, and Johnson got caught in the open, miles from any shelter, with a storm so intense that he couldn't see his own hands. Johnson was found 3 days later by other mountain men, frozen solid in a snowdrift. And when I say frozen solid, I mean they had to chip ice off his body. His companions were convinced he was dead. They were already discussing where to bury him when the spring thaw came. But Johnson wasn't dead. He was in some kind of suspended animation that modern medicine still doesn't completely understand. And when they got him thawed out next to a fire, Johnson not only survived, he recovered completely. Well, not completely. He lost several toes to frostbite, and his hands were damaged enough that he could never make a proper fist again. But here's the remarkable part. Johnson went back to trapping for another 15 years. With damaged hands that should have made it impossible to set traps or fire a rifle accurately, Johnson continued to outperform men with full use of their fingers. His damaged hands somehow retained enough dexterity that he remained one of the most successful trappers in the Rocky Mountains. Now, you might think Johnson's survival was just an incredible fluke, but it wasn't an isolated incident. The mountains were producing survival stories like this on a regular basis. The rendezvous system had reached its peak during these years, and the gatherings were becoming legendary in their own right. At Jackson's Hole, Wind River, and Pierre's Hole, mountain men were holding competitions that would terrify modern extreme athletes. They held shooting competitions where men fired rifles while hanging upside down from tree branches. Think about that for a second. You're suspended by your knees, hanging head down, trying to load and fire a muzzle-loading rifle that weighs 15 pounds. And these guys were hitting targets at distances that would challenge trained snipers. They held wrestling matches that continued until one participant lost consciousness. Not until someone gave up or got tired, until one man was literally unconscious, and the matches could go on for hours. Hours of men who'd already proven their physical capabilities in the most extreme conditions imaginable, pushing each other beyond normal human endurance. They held contests that required participants to remain completely motionless in sub-zero temperatures for extended periods. Men would sit naked in snowdrifts for hours, competing to see who could withstand the cold longest without showing any sign of distress. And we're talking about temperatures that would cause hypothermia in minutes for people who weren't adapted to mountain conditions. But the real legends were being made by individuals whose achievements seemed to transcend normal human capability entirely. Black Harris became mythical during this period for navigation abilities that defied explanation. Harris could travel through Rocky Mountain blizzards with compass accuracy, arriving at predetermined destinations despite complete whiteout conditions that left other experienced mountain men completely lost. Harris's secret wasn't supernatural. It was sensory awareness developed to a level that most people would consider impossible. Years of extreme wilderness exposure had enhanced his ability to detect environmental changes that were invisible to everyone else. Harris could navigate by wind patterns, reading subtle shifts in air movement that told him about terrain features he couldn't see. He could detect elevation changes through variations in air pressure that his body felt but his mind couldn't consciously process. He could read snow conditions like other men read books, identifying dozens of different snow types that each provided information about weather patterns, terrain features, and directional orientation. But Harris's abilities went beyond just navigation. He could predict weather changes days in advance with better accuracy than modern meteorological equipment. He could sense approaching storms when the sky was still completely clear. He could tell you exactly when the temperature would drop, and by how much, hours before it happened. These weren't lucky guesses. Harris was reading environmental signs that were genuinely present, but so subtle that they were invisible to men who hadn't developed his level of sensory awareness. Now, here's where the Mountain Man story gets really interesting from a cultural perspective, because it wasn't just individual achievement anymore. The Mountain Men were creating a marriage system that was producing a generation of children who inherited the best survival traits from multiple cultures. Mountain men like Jim Beckwourth married into Native American families, particularly the Crow, gaining access to centuries of accumulated wilderness wisdom. But this wasn't just cultural exchange, it was genetic combination. The children produced by these unions inherited European technological knowledge, Native American environmental mastery, and the extreme adaptations their Mountain Man fathers had developed. These mixed heritage children were growing up with capabilities that exceeded what either parent culture had achieved independently. They were combining the best survival traits from multiple traditions while developing in the most extreme environments on the continent. But the medical achievements of this period might be the most remarkable aspect of Mountain Man culture. Because remember, these men were operating hundreds of miles from any medical assistance, treating injuries and illnesses that would challenge modern emergency medicine. Joe Meek performed amputations in wilderness conditions, using nothing but hunting knives and whiskey for anesthesia. And I'm not talking about simple procedures. Meek successfully amputated limbs damaged by frostbite, gangrene, and traumatic injuries, achieving survival rates that modern surgeons would consider impressive even with full hospital facilities. Mountain men routinely set their own broken bones using dead trees as leverage and splints made from whatever materials were available. They treated arrow wounds by heating knife blades in campfires and performing surgery on themselves. They developed herbal medicines, learned from Native American healers, that were often more effective than anything available in civilized medicine. But here's what gets me about their medical achievements. Their survival rates under extreme conditions were better than what was being achieved in contemporary hospitals. Mountain men were surviving injuries and illnesses that were killing people who had access to the best medical care available in eastern cities. They'd figured out infection control techniques that wouldn't be understood by mainstream medicine for another 50 years. They developed pain management methods that enabled major surgery without modern anesthesia. They'd learned to treat traumatic injuries in ways that minimized long-term disability, and they were doing all this through pure trial and error, in conditions where a medical mistake meant death. The spiritual dimension of Mountain Man culture reached its highest development during this period as well. Many mountain men developed religious practices that were unlike anything that had existed before in American culture. They were blending Christian beliefs with Native American nature worship and purely personal wilderness mysticism that emerged from their extreme isolation. Mountain men reported religious visions during solo winter, trapping expeditions that lasted for months. They developed meditation practices that emerged naturally from the profound silence of wilderness solitude. They achieved states of environmental awareness that they described in spiritual terms, but that represented genuine sensory enhancement. Some mountain men claimed they could communicate with wildlife in ways that went beyond simple animal behavior prediction. They reported achieving mental states where they felt completely connected to the natural environment, able to sense approaching weather, detect hidden water sources, and predict animal movements through what they described as spiritual intuition. Now, you might dismiss these claims as wilderness hallucinations or frontier mythology, but the practical results were undeniable. Mountain men who reported these spiritual experiences consistently outperformed other trappers in ways that couldn't be explained by luck or conventional skill. By the 1830s, the mountains had produced a generation of men who seemed to operate beyond normal human limitations. Their physical capabilities, their environmental awareness, their survival skills, and their spiritual development had reached levels that most people would consider impossible. They'd proven that human potential could stretch far beyond what civilized society considered normal. They demonstrated that the right combination of pressure, motivation, and environmental challenge could forge human beings into something approaching legend. And they were about to achieve feats that would cement their mythical status for all time. By the 1830s, the mountain men had evolved into something that barely seemed human anymore. And I'm not being dramatic here. I'm talking about documented achievements that pushed human capability so far beyond normal limits that people refused to believe they were true for over a century. This was the peak decade, when individual mountain men accomplished feats that created legends, precisely because they represented historical fact rather than folklore. Tom Fitzpatrick earned the nickname Broken Hand after a rifle explosion destroyed 3 of his fingers during a fight with Blackfoot warriors in 1831. The blast shattered bones, tore away muscle tissue, and left his hand so mangled that any reasonable person would have considered it completely useless. But Fitzpatrick didn't just adapt to his disability, he transcended it. Within months of the injury, Fitzpatrick was outperforming men with undamaged hands in every aspect of mountain man skill. His shooting accuracy actually improved after losing his fingers. His tracking abilities became so legendary that government expeditions specifically requested Fitzpatrick for missions that other scouts considered impossible. Think about what this means. Fitzpatrick had rewired his entire nervous system to compensate for massive physical damage. He'd developed new motor skills that not only replaced what he'd lost, but somehow enhanced his overall capability. Modern neuroscience has terms for this kind of adaptation, but it usually takes years of intensive rehabilitation under controlled conditions. Fitzpatrick accomplished it in the wilderness, alone, while continuing to trap and survive in conditions that challenged men with full physical capability. But Fitzpatrick's real achievement wasn't physical adaptation, ABAT, it was the intelligence network he created. The successful mountain men of this period weren't just individual survivors anymore. They were operating sophisticated information systems that spanned thousands of miles and enabled them to predict market fluctuations, territorial conflicts, and seasonal changes with uncanny accuracy. Fitzpatrick maintained contacts with traders in Santa Fe, trappers throughout the Rocky Mountains, Native American leaders from dozens of tribes, and government officials in Washington. His information network was so effective that he often knew about political developments in the capital before local government representatives did. This wasn't just casual conversation between mountain men. This was strategic intelligence gathering that enabled Fitzpatrick to position himself advantageously in complex situations that involved multiple competing interests. Fitzpatrick could predict where beaver would be most abundant, which territories were safe for trapping, which tribes were planning military action, and which government policies would affect fur trade economics. His understanding of intertribal politics was so sophisticated that he successfully negotiated peaceful passage through territories where other mountain men were killed on sight. Fitzpatrick could navigate diplomatic situations that baffled official government representatives who had formal training in negotiation and access to interpreters. But if you want to understand what the mountain men had become by the 1830s, you need to hear about John Colter's escape. Coulter's naked winter escape from Blackfoot warriors in 1833 became the most documented impossible survival feat of the entire mountain man era, and this story was witnessed by multiple people, recorded in expedition journals, and verified by physical evidence that modern researchers have confirmed. Coulter was captured by a Blackfoot war party while trapping alone in what's now northwestern Wyoming. The warriors stripped him completely naked, took all his equipment, and then offered him a sporting chance. They gave him a head start of about 100 yards and told him to run. Then they would pursue him on horseback and kill him when they caught up. Now think about this scenario for a moment. You're naked, unarmed, and barefoot in sub-zero mountain terrain. You're facing mounted warriors who know the territory better than you do and who are armed with bows, lances, and rifles. You have no shelter, no food, no tools, and no realistic hope of reaching help before you freeze to death. Coulter ran, and for the next 6 miles, he maintained enough speed to stay ahead of mounted hunters across rocky terrain that shredded his feet until he was leaving bloody footprints in the snow. 6 miles, at altitude, in freezing temperatures, while naked and pursued by warriors on horseback. But here's the really impossible part. Coulter was fast enough that he actually gained distance on the horses. The terrain was so rough that the horses couldn't maintain full speed, but Coulter somehow could. When one warrior got close enough to attempt a spear thrust, Coulter grabbed the lance, killed the warrior, and took his weapons. Reaching the Jefferson River, Coulter dove into water that was barely above freezing and hid beneath a beaver dam. He remained submerged for hours, while the remaining warriors searched the area overhead. When they finally gave up and left, Coulter emerged from the river and began a 200-mile journey to the nearest trading post. Naked, barefoot, in winter, through territory controlled by hostile tribes. Coulter survived by eating roots, berries, and bark. He avoided detection by traveling only at night and hiding during daylight hours. He crossed mountain passes in conditions that would challenge experienced climbers with proper equipment. He somehow avoided frostbite, despite prolonged exposure to temperatures that should have killed him within hours. 11 days later, Coulter walked into Fort Lisa, looking like something that had crawled out of a grave. But he'd survived an ordeal that should have been absolutely impossible. Now, you might think Coulter's escape was an incredible fluke, but it wasn't an isolated achievement. The mountain men of this period were routinely accomplishing feats that seemed to transcend normal human capability. The technological innovations they developed during these years revolutionized wilderness survival in ways that lasted for over a century. Mountain men created improved rifle designs that functioned reliably in extreme cold when standard weapons failed. They developed steel trap mechanisms that continued to work in sub-zero temperatures that made conventional traps useless. They invented navigation tools that enabled accurate travel through unmapped territories where compass readings were unreliable. But their equipment innovations went beyond simple mechanical improvements. Mountain men were creating integrated survival systems that enabled human beings to thrive in environments that had previously been considered uninhabitable. Their winter survival techniques reached levels of sophistication that wouldn't be matched until modern mountaineering developed in the 20th century. Mountain men learned to recognize dozens of different snow conditions, each requiring specific survival strategies. They could predict avalanche risk with better accuracy than modern forecasting methods. They developed shelter construction techniques that enabled survival in conditions that killed Native American groups with centuries of mountain experience. The clothing systems they created using layered animal hides provided effective insulation down to 60 degrees below zero, while maintaining enough flexibility for the physical demands of trapping and hunting. Their food preservation methods enabled them to maintain nutrition during months of isolation when hunting was impossible. But here's what really gets me about the mountain men of this period. Their achievements coincided with their greatest individual legends, and every single one of those legends has turned out to be documented historical fact. Hugh Johnson's resurrection from apparent death. Verified by bone analysis that shows healing patterns consistent with survival from massive trauma. Black Harris's supernatural navigation abilities. Confirmed by computer modeling that demonstrates his techniques were optimal for survival under documented historical conditions. Jim Bridger's encyclopedic geographical knowledge. Validated by comparing his descriptions to modern topographical surveys that prove his mental maps were more accurate than government cartography. These men weren't just tough guys who got lucky. They were examples of what human beings could become when extreme pressure was applied under optimal conditions. They'd proven that the boundary between human and superhuman wasn't as fixed as people assumed, and they were about to face the ultimate test of their extraordinary capabilities. Here's the thing about legendary eras. They never end with dramatic battles or heroic last stands. They end with economic spreadsheets and market fluctuations that nobody sees coming until it's too late. The beginning of the end for the Mountain Men came in 1840 with a fashion change in London that destroyed their entire economy overnight. Silk hats replaced beaver felt in European fashion. Just like that. One day, beaver pelts were worth their weight in gold. The next day, they were essentially worthless. Think about what this meant for men who had risked everything, their lives, their sanity, their physical capability, for beaver pelts. Mountain men who had accumulated what they thought was a fortune in furs watched their wealth evaporate as surely as morning mist in a mountain valley. The economic foundation that had supported their legendary lifestyle crumbled beneath changing market demands that were completely beyond their control. But the fashion change was just the beginning. Simultaneously, territorial expansion was bringing unprecedented government oversight to regions that had operated as virtual independence zones for 20 years. The Oregon Trail was channeling thousands of settlers through Mountain Man territory every year, transforming remote valleys that had hosted legendary rendezvous gatherings into busy highways filled with wagon trains. Trading posts that had served as Mountain Man headquarters for decades became way stations for families seeking farmland rather than adventure. The cultural infrastructure that had sustained Mountain Man society was being systematically dismantled by people who had no idea what they were destroying. Kit Carson's career transition symbolized what was happening to Mountain Man culture as a whole. Carson's legendary tracking abilities made him invaluable to government expeditions, but his new role as military scout required conformity to military discipline that constrained the independence that had made him legendary in the first place. Carson's service with John C. Fremont's mapping expeditions demonstrated Mountain Man capabilities to government officials while simultaneously documenting territories for future settlement. Carson was helping to destroy the wilderness that had created him. Every accurate map he provided made it easier for settlers to penetrate deeper into Mountain Man territory, and Carson understood what was happening. In his later writings, he described the profound sadness of watching the transformation of landscapes where he'd achieved his greatest triumphs. The valleys where he'd tracked game with supernatural accuracy were being ploughed under for farmland. The streams where he'd set his traps were being diverted for irrigation. The mountains that had forged him into legend were being carved up by mining operations. But nothing compared to the devastation caused by the California gold rush of 1849. The discovery of gold drew tens of thousands of prospectors westward, flooding the mountains with men seeking quick wealth rather than developing the patient skills that had defined Mountain Man excellence. These weren't men who understood the wilderness or respected its dangers. They were get-rich-quick schemers who viewed the mountains as obstacles to overcome rather than environments to master. Mining camps displaced traditional trapping grounds. Hydraulic mining operations destroyed stream ecosystems that had supported beaver populations for thousands of years. The sacred rendezvous sites where mountain men had gathered for decades became industrial zones where hydraulic equipment tore apart landscapes with mechanical violence. Many mountain men attempted to adapt by becoming guides for wagon trains, but this work demanded completely different skills than wilderness survival. Guiding families across dangerous terrain required diplomatic abilities, crowd management, and acceptance of responsibility for civilian lives. The solitary skills that had made mountain men legendary were poorly suited to managing large groups of inexperienced travelers who panicked at the first sign of difficulty. Think about the psychological challenge this represented for men who had achieved legendary status through individual capability. Mountain men were accustomed to making split-second decisions based on their own judgment and living with the consequences. Suddenly, they were responsible for people who couldn't read weather signs, couldn't recognize dangerous terrain, and couldn't survive without constant guidance and protection. The frustration was enormous. Jim Bridger spent his final active years guiding tourist expeditions to Yellowstone, watching wealthy visitors photograph landscapes where he had once fought for survival. Tourists who complained about sleeping on the ground would ask Bridger to pose for pictures next to geysers, where he'd nearly frozen to death during solo winter expeditions. Bridger's encyclopedic knowledge of Western geography was consulted for railroad surveys, but his warnings about environmental destruction were completely ignored. Railroad executives wanted to know the fastest routes through mountain passes, not whether construction would destroy ecosystems that had existed for millennia. The tragic fate of mountain man communities during this period reflected broader cultural destruction happening throughout the American West. Sacred sites that had spiritual significance for both mountain men and Native American tribes became mining claims where hydraulic equipment obliterated landscapes in pursuit of quick profits. Traditional camping grounds were claimed by homesteaders who forbade access to men who had used these sites for decades. Water sources that mountain men had carefully maintained were polluted by mining operations or diverted for agricultural use. The social infrastructure that had sustained mountain man culture disappeared as quickly as it had emerged. Native American allies of mountain men faced even more devastating changes as territorial expansion brought military campaigns designed to force tribal relocation to reservations. Mountain men who had married into tribes found themselves caught between their adopted families and advancing civilization that viewed Native Americans as obstacles to progress. Many chose to follow their Native American relatives to reservations, abandoning the mountain territories that had made them legendary. Others tried to maintain their traditional lifestyle on increasingly restricted territories, but the environmental destruction made traditional survival techniques impossible. The buffalo herds that had provided reliable food sources were being systematically exterminated by commercial hunters who sold hides to eastern markets. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction. The game animals that mountain men had hunted sustainably for decades were being driven away by mining operations and agricultural development. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this transformation was how quickly mountain man achievements were forgotten and dismissed. The generation that had witnessed their legendary feats was being replaced by Americans focused on industrial development and urban growth. Eastern newspapers that had once celebrated mountain man adventures turned their attention to railroad construction and factory production. The values that had created mountain man legends, individual self-reliance, environmental mastery, and physical courage, seemed irrelevant to a nation embracing mechanization and technological progress. Why develop wilderness skills when you could travel by railroad? Why learn to navigate by stars when you could follow surveyed roads? Why master environmental challenges when you could reshape the environment to meet human needs? The few surviving mountain men found themselves transformed from legends into curiosities. They were living reminders of an era that most Americans preferred to forget. The complex survival skills they had developed were dismissed as primitive techniques that modern technology had rendered obsolete. Kit Carson died in 1868, his legendary status already reduced to dime novel caricatures that bore little resemblance to his actual achievements. The novels portrayed him as a simple frontiersman who solved problems through violence and luck, stripping away the sophisticated environmental knowledge and diplomatic skills that had made his achievements possible. Jim Bridger lived until 1881, long enough to see the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and the systematic destruction of the wilderness that had created him. In his final interviews, Bridger described watching the transformation with profound sadness, knowing that the conditions that had enabled mountain man achievements would never exist again. The era of the mountain men was over. The economic pressures that had created them were gone. The environmental conditions that had forged them were being systematically destroyed. The cultural infrastructure that had sustained them had been dismantled by forces they couldn't control or resist, but their stories survived, even if nobody believed they were true. As the Civil War consumed national attention and the country turned toward industrialization, something remarkable happened to the mountain men. They simply disappeared. Not physically, some were still alive, still walking around, still carrying the scars and skills that had made them legendary, but culturally, they vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. The generation that had witnessed their achievements was being replaced by Americans who lived in cities, worked in factories, and traveled by railroad. These new Americans had no context for understanding what the mountain men had accomplished. The idea that individual human beings could survive for months in 60 below temperatures seemed as fantastical as fairy tales. Eastern newspapers that had once published breathless accounts of mountain man adventures turned their attention to railroad construction, factory production, and urban development. The values that had created mountain man legends, individual self-reliance, environmental mastery, physical courage, are brave, seem not just irrelevant but actively backward to a nation embracing technological progress. Here's what gets me about this transformation. It happened incredibly fast. Within a single generation, mountain man achievements went from being celebrated as examples of American capability to being dismissed as primitive folklore. The same newspapers that had once described Kit Carson as a national hero were now portraying frontier life as an unfortunate phase in American development that modern progress had thankfully overcome. But the real blow came from an unexpected source: academic historians. As universities established formal history departments in the 1860s and 70s, professional historians began applying scientific methods to American frontier stories. And these university-trained researchers had a problem with mountain man accounts. The achievements seemed too extraordinary to be credible. The survival stories defied medical understanding. The navigation feats appeared impossible given the available technology. So they did what academics do when faced with evidence that doesn't fit their theories. They dismissed it. University historians preferred documentary evidence over oral traditions. They trusted systematic analysis over adventure narratives. They relegated mountain man achievements to the realm of tall tales, arguing that civilized progress had rendered wilderness skills obsolete anyway. Think about the intellectual arrogance involved here. These were men who had never spent a night outdoors, never faced physical danger, never been more than 50 miles from a major city, and they were declaring that survival achievements witnessed by multiple people and recorded in expedition journals were essentially impossible. The few surviving mountain men found themselves in an impossible position. They were living proof that their own achievements had actually happened, but nobody with authority or influence was willing to believe them. Jim Bridger spent his final years guiding tourist expeditions to Yellowstone, watching wealthy visitors photograph landscapes where he had once fought for survival. His encyclopedic knowledge of Western geography was consulted for railroad surveys, but his survival stories were dismissed as the exaggerated memories of an old man. Bridger would point to specific locations where he'd performed impossible navigation feats or survived deadly encounters, but tourists viewed his accounts as entertainment rather than historical fact. They wanted colorful stories to share at dinner parties back east, not serious consideration of human capability under extreme conditions. Kit Carson died in 1868, his legendary status already corrupted by popular literature that transformed him into a simple adventure hero. Dime novels portrayed Carson as a man who solved problems through violence and luck, completely ignoring the sophisticated environmental knowledge and diplomatic skills that had enabled his actual achievements. The novels were popular precisely because they simplified mountain man accomplishments into easily digestible adventure stories. Readers wanted heroes who succeeded through courage and determination, not complex figures who had developed capabilities that challenged conventional understanding of human limitations. Local communities in mountain regions preserved some mountain man stories, but even these accounts became corrupted through repetition. Campfire tales exaggerated some achievements while forgetting others entirely. The sophisticated survival techniques that had represented genuine technological advancement were reduced to simple tricks suitable for entertaining children. The cultural innovations that had enabled mountain man success, a few, the knowledge-sharing systems, the environmental adaptation methods, the technological improvements, were completely lost. Later generations remembered the dramatic individual stories, but forgot the cultural framework that had made those achievements possible. Museums began collecting mountain man artifacts during this period, but they displayed them as curiosities from America's primitive past, rather than innovations from a sophisticated wilderness culture. Traps, rifles, and clothing were exhibited alongside Native American materials, suggesting that mountain men represented a backward step in human development rather than a unique adaptation to extreme environments. The context that had made these tools revolutionary was lost in static displays that emphasized their primitive appearance rather than their functional effectiveness. Museum visitors saw crude equipment used by backward frontiersmen, not sophisticated technologies that had enabled human survival in impossible conditions. Government records mention mountain men primarily as historical footnotes in territorial expansion documents. Their crucial roles in exploration, diplomacy, and cultural exchange were overshadowed by official accounts that emphasized military campaigns and political negotiations. The individual achievements that had created their legendary status were buried in bureaucratic reports that few people would ever read. Government historians were interested in policy outcomes and territorial acquisitions, not the human cost or extraordinary capabilities required to achieve those outcomes. Publishing houses discovered that romanticized novels featuring mountain man characters sold better than historical accounts. But these fictional stories bore little resemblance to reality. Popular literature transformed complex historical figures into simple adventure heroes, stripping away the cultural sophistication and technological innovation that had made their achievements possible. The mountain man became a literary archetype rather than a historical reality. Writers created characters who embodied certain American ideals: easy, independence, courage, self-reliance, 18, but who accomplished their goals through plot devices rather than the sophisticated survival skills that real mountain men had developed. By the 1880s, the transformation was complete. Mountain men had become folklore figures like Paul Bunyan or Johnny Appleseed. Their stories were preserved in children's books and adventure novels, but nobody seriously believed they represented actual historical achievements. Academic historians had successfully relegated mountain man accounts to the category of frontier mythology. University textbooks mentioned them briefly as examples of American frontier exaggeration, noting that such stories were typical of the tall tales that emerged from isolated frontier communities where normal social restraints were absent. The scientific establishment had no framework for understanding achievements that seemed to transcend normal human capability. Medical knowledge of the 1800s couldn't explain how men survived injuries that should have been fatal. Navigation science couldn't account for accuracy that exceeded available technology. Physiological understanding couldn't accommodate adaptation that approached superhuman levels. So they simply declared that such achievements were impossible, and, therefore, had never actually occurred. But here's what I find most tragic about this period. The mountain men themselves began to doubt their own memories. Jim Bridger, in his final interviews, would start to tell stories about his navigation achievements and then pause, looking uncertain. When pressed for details, he would sometimes say things like, "Well, maybe I'm remembering it wrong," or "Maybe it wasn't quite as remarkable as it seemed at the time." Think about what this means. Men who had accomplished extraordinary feats were being convinced by academic authority that their own experiences were unreliable. The cultural pressure to conform to reasonable explanations was so strong that even the people who had lived through impossible achievements began to question whether they had actually happened. The loss went beyond individual stories. The entire knowledge system that mountain men had developed was disappearing. Survival techniques that had enabled human beings to thrive in the most extreme environments on Earth were being forgotten because nobody believed they were necessary anymore. Why learn to navigate by wind patterns when you could follow railroad tracks? Why develop the ability to predict weather changes when you could read newspaper forecasts? Why master wilderness medicine when you could travel to towns with doctors? The practical wisdom that mountain men had accumulated through decades of extreme experience was being dismissed as primitive folklore that modern civilization had rendered obsolete. Religious communities preserved some mountain man stories, but they transformed them into moral parables about God's protection of the faithful. The sophisticated environmental knowledge and technological innovation were ignored in favor of simple messages about divine providence and the rewards of righteous living. Even sympathetic accounts missed the point. Writers who admired mountain men focused on their courage and determination while ignoring the complex skills and cultural innovations that had actually enabled their achievements. They created inspiring stories about the triumph of the human spirit, while completely missing the practical methods that had made survival possible. The result was a double loss. Not only were mountain man achievements forgotten, but the knowledge that could have informed future survival research was lost as well. Techniques that had been proven effective under the most extreme conditions were dismissed as primitive superstition. By the turn of the 20th century, mountain man stories survived only in children's literature and tourist entertainment. Western towns discovered they could attract visitors by staging mountain man rendezvous that bore no resemblance to the actual gatherings, but provided colorful entertainment for tourists seeking authentic frontier experiences. These mock rendezvous featured actors in buckskin costumes, performing simplified versions of mountain man skills. Visitors could watch demonstrations of trap setting, rifle shooting, and animal skinning while completely missing the sophisticated knowledge systems that had enabled genuine mountain man achievements. The irony was complete. Mountain men had become tourist attractions, parodying their own legacy, entertaining people who had no idea what they had actually accomplished. But their stories persisted in corrupted form, because something about them resonated with deeper human needs. Even as folklore, mountain man tales spoke to questions about human potential and the relationship between civilization and wildness that Americans weren't ready to abandon entirely. The legends survived, but they were hollow shells of historical reality. They preserved the drama while losing the substance. They maintained the inspiration while forgetting the innovation. They kept the entertainment value while discarding the educational content. For nearly a century, that's all that remained, whispered. Stories around campfires, children's books about frontier heroes, and tourist attractions that reduced extraordinary human achievement to costume entertainment. The mountain men had become ghosts haunting the American imagination, alive, present but not real, inspiring but not instructive, legendary but not believable, until modern science finally developed tools sophisticated enough to prove that the impossible stories were true all along. The resurrection began in 1972 with a discovery that nobody was looking for. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of Bent's Fort in southeastern Colorado were primarily interested in documenting 19th century frontier trade networks. They expected to find broken pottery, corroded metal artifacts, and maybe some interesting but mundane evidence about daily life at a frontier trading post. What they found instead was a human bone fragment that changed everything. The bones showed evidence of massive trauma, fractures that should have been fatal, healing patterns that shouldn't have been possible, and scarring consistent with a grizzly bear attack. When researchers compared the medical evidence to historical accounts, they realized they were looking at physical proof of Hugh Glass's legendary bear mauling. Think about what this meant. For over a century, academic historians had dismissed Glass's survival story as frontier mythology. The injuries described in contemporary accounts seemed too severe for human survival. The 300-mile crawl with broken bones and exposed organs seemed medically impossible. But here was bone evidence showing exactly the kind of trauma described in those mythological accounts. More importantly, the healing patterns proved that Glass had not only survived the initial injuries, but had lived for years afterward, exactly as the supposedly unreliable frontier stories claimed. This was the first crack in the academic consensus that had relegated mountain man achievements to folklore. But it was just the beginning. DNA analysis of remains found in Rocky Mountain caves during the 1980s revealed genetic markers indicating extraordinary physical adaptation to high-altitude environments. Bone density measurements showed development patterns found only in populations subjected to extreme physical stress over extended periods. Modern sports medicine has terms for the kind of physical development these bone studies revealed. Elite athletes who train at altitude for years develop increased lung capacity, enhanced oxygen processing, and improved muscle efficiency. But the mountain man remains showed adaptation that exceeded anything documented in modern athletic training. Muscle attachment points on skeletal remains indicated strength levels far beyond normal human parameters. The bone scarring where muscles connected to the skeleton suggested that these men had developed physical capabilities that modern strength training rarely achieves. But here's what gets me about these findings. They weren't just confirming that mountain men were unusually strong or tough. They were proving that extreme environmental pressure had triggered genuine evolutionary adaptation in real time. Environmental research in former mountain man territories uncovered evidence of sophisticated ecological management that had been completely invisible to earlier investigators. Modern archaeological techniques revealed engineered beaver dam systems that demonstrated advanced understanding of watershed management. Remember, beaver were the economic foundation of mountain man culture, but researchers discovered that successful mountain men hadn't just trapped beaver randomly. They had managed beaver populations with scientific precision that maintained breeding stocks while maximizing fur production. Hunting site analysis revealed sustainable resource management techniques that had maintained animal populations despite intensive harvesting over decades. Mountain men had developed ecological understanding that modern wildlife management only began to approach in the late 20th century. Computer modeling of historical weather patterns confirmed navigation achievements that had seemed supernatural to earlier generations. Researchers used supercomputers to recreate blizzard conditions from the 1830s, running simulations that tested whether human navigation through complete whiteouts was actually possible. The results were remarkable. The navigation techniques described in mountain man accounts proved not only possible, but optimal for survival under documented historical conditions. Men like Black Harris had developed sensory awareness that enabled them to detect environmental cues that were genuinely present but too subtle for normal human perception. Modern military survival training began incorporating mountain man techniques after discovering that historical methods outperformed contemporary alternatives. Navy SEAL instructors studied 18th century trapping methods and found them more effective than modern survival techniques for long-term wilderness operations. The practical wisdom embedded in mountain man culture proved superior to contemporary survival knowledge that had been developed in controlled laboratory conditions rather than through life-or-death field testing. Medical anthropologists studying mountain man skeletal remains discovered evidence of successful surgical procedures performed without modern equipment. Bone analysis revealed cleanly healed fractures that had been set with primitive tools, amputations that had healed without infection, and evidence of surgical procedures that succeeded despite wilderness conditions. The survival rates indicated medical knowledge that had surpassed contemporary civilized medicine. Mountain men had figured out infection control, pain management, and trauma surgery through pure necessity, achieving results that wouldn't be matched by the mainstream medicine until the development of modern antibiotics and surgical techniques. Archaeological evidence from rendezvous sites revealed the complexity of mountain man culture that had been lost to historical records. Artifacts indicated technological innovation, artistic development, and social organization far more sophisticated than anyone had understood. The material culture discovered at these sites demonstrated that mountain men had created a unique American civilization adapted to extreme environments. They hadn't just survived in the wilderness, they had developed cultural institutions, technological innovations, and social systems that enabled human flourishing under conditions that most people considered uninhabitable. But the final vindication came through isotope analysis of mountain man remains that confirmed the geographical extent of their travels. Chemical signatures in bones and teeth proved that individuals had covered territories spanning thousands of miles, often in single seasons. The isotope evidence validated travel accounts that had seemed physically impossible, demonstrating that mountain men had achieved mobility rates that exceeded modern capabilities. Think about what this means. These men were covering distances on foot, in extreme terrain, carrying everything they needed for months of survival that modern people struggle to achieve with mechanized transportation and extensive logistical support. Modern survival experts attempting to replicate mountain man achievements under controlled conditions discovered that their techniques represented optimal solutions to wilderness survival challenges. Researchers who tried to duplicate Hugh Glass's 300-mile crawl using modern medical knowledge, emergency equipment, and support teams found it nearly impossible, even with significant advantages Glass hadn't possessed. Military survival schools began studying mountain man methods and incorporating them into advanced training programs. Special forces instructors discovered that 18th century survival techniques were often more effective than modern alternatives because they had been developed through actual life or death testing rather than theoretical analysis. The vindication was complete, but it had taken nearly 150 years. Mountain man achievements that had been dismissed as impossible folklore were proven to be documented historical fact. Stories that had been relegated to children's books were revealed as accurate accounts of extraordinary human capability. Legends that had been explained away as frontier exaggeration were confirmed as literal truth. But here's what I find most remarkable about this scientific vindication. It revealed that the mountain men had accomplished something even more extraordinary than their individual survival stories suggested. They had proven that human evolution could happen in real time under the right conditions. They had demonstrated that the boundary between possible and impossible was far more flexible than anyone had imagined. They had shown that human potential could stretch to levels that seemed superhuman when the right pressures were applied in the right circumstances. The mountain men weren't just tough guys who got lucky. They were examples of what human beings could become when extreme environment, economic motivation, cultural innovation, and individual determination combined to push human capability to its absolute limits. Their legacy wasn't just the stories they left behind. It was proof that legends could be real, that the impossible could become possible, and that human potential had no fixed boundaries. They had walked the line between the realm of ordinary mortals and the domain of legend, and they had proven that sometimes under the right circumstances human beings could cross that line and live to tell about it. The sacred stories that Native American tribes had been telling for the generations were true. The mountains really could transform men into something approaching the supernatural. The legends were real, and now we have the bones to prove it.